Hello wrestling fans. Welcome back to the $20 million Pro Wrestle Machine studio and welcome back to the show. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. September 22, 1997 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. Huge issue with Fritz von Erich bio. USWA and AJW troubles, Terry Funk retirement in Amarillo. Fall Brawl report. And much more. By Observer staff. Fantasy versus reality. For most people in the real world, for the most part, they know the difference. In pro wrestling, among both its performers and its fans, sometimes the line gets a little blurred. Often that's dismissed as simply harmless. But sometimes when the line is blurred for long enough, where the difference is no longer perceptible, or even worse, when the fantasy becomes the reality, it creates a situation of potential danger. The danger is that the day may come when the bubble is burst and the fantasy is over and one isn't equipped to deal with the reality. From Death of a Dynasty, the March 1, 1993 edition of the Wrestling Observer. Jack Adkisson, easily among the most notable figures in the history of this industry, passed away on September 10 from cancer at the age of 68 at his home in Lake Dallas, Texas. Jack Adkisson was many things and many different people during his lifetime. He was Fritz von Erich, the monstrous post-World War II Nazi heel with the Iron Claw, one of the biggest stars with arguably the most famous finishing hold of his era. He was Jack Adkisson, a millionaire from the real estate industry who for nearly 2 decades was one of the leading promoters and most powerful figures behind the scenes in the pro wrestling world. He was the Texas-bred and Texas-fed local hero, the self-promoted toughest man alive in his own created fantasy world whose iron claw squeezed the blood in the heart out of every huge villain who crossed his path. He was the patriarch of the ultimate fantasy all-American family, almost a Texas version of the Kennedys, known as the Von Erichs, with an even more tragic end result. The Von Erichs were portrayed as clean living, strongly religious, with off-the-charts athletic ability, all of whom were going to be world heavyweight champions, a fantasy of which exploded into the harshest of realities imaginable when his sons felt they couldn't live up their father's promotional image of them. He was the God-fearing all-American father who not only was able to sell his promotional fantasy to wrestling fans, but also moved in major religious circles with appearances on the 700 Club. He was a pioneer in modernizing pro wrestling on television. He had a unique ability to build up a major wrestling event as a high-class sports spectacular. He set new standards for poor taste that may never be equaled when it comes to promotion of wrestling. Within the state of Texas, and certainly the northern part, he was the single most famous pro wrestling personality of all time. He was large, rough, athletic, single-minded, had an amazing presence and was domineering of all who were around him. His life was, without question, one of the most incredible, bizarre, freakish roller coaster rides of twists and turns of anyone's. Some would say his life was the ultimate proof of karma. But even if it was, even then one has to question whether any man deserved the pain he had to live the last years of his life in. But no matter how bad he was, or how good he was, or what a huge star he was as an active wrestler and how many sellouts he drew, how powerful he was behind the scenes, one aspect of his life will far outshine all others. He had 6 children. 5 of them wrestled. Only one of them lived to see his 34th birthday. 3 of them had the potential to be and for a short time were among the very biggest stars in the industry. 4 of them died from either drug overdoses or suicide. Before there was Fritz von Erich, there was the real-life Jack Adkisson. He grew up in East Dallas, went on to Southern Methodist University where he was a member of the 1949 football team which included college football legend Doak Walker. While in later years his accomplishments were exaggerated to being Walker's lead blocker and an all-conference lineman, he was actually a backup player who was only on the team 1 year because he lost his scholarship during the offseason when he violated team rules and got married. He did have potential as a track star, setting the school record in the discus, but because he lost his scholarship and left school, was never able to go farther with it, and years later, perhaps trying to live out a part of his life he never fulfilled, coached and bought his son Kerry steroids and succeeded in molding him into becoming one of the best high school discus throwers in the country. He had a tryout with the old Dallas Texans of the NFL, but failed to make it, and went to Canada to try and continue his football career. He wound up in Edmonton, Alberta, with the Eskimos, and crossed paths with Stu Hart in 1953. At the time, Hart was the local wrestling promoter, whose Klondike Wrestling in Edmonton predated Stampede Wrestling in Calgary, which started a few years later. Hart remembered training Adkisson, a 6'4", 275-pound agile man with huge thighs and small arms, breaking him in along with other future wrestling greats such as Ilio DiPaolo and his later huge rival, Gene Kiniski, and remembered DiPaolo getting the better of Adkisson in training. He lived in a trailer park on the Hart property with his wife Doris and newborn son, Jackie Jr. because men who combined his size with his agility and athletic ability were a rarity in wrestling in the 50s. He became an almost immediate star, and it was only a few years into his career that Fritz von Erich, master of the Iron Claw, was born. German heels, complete with goose step and paying homage to the Führer, flourished after World War II, few of whom actually had ever set foot in Germany in their lifetimes, similar to the proliferation of Hawaiians who masqueraded as sneaky Japanese salt-throwing heels. But none came close to rivaling Fritz von Erich, with his size, presence, big hands, sneer, and deadly grip, where he would squeeze the temples of his opponent, usually resulting in gruesome blood and submission. He was remembered as the inventor of the face claw, and whether that is true or not, he certainly was most responsible for popularizing the move that was later copied by numerous German clawmasters of later generations, from Baron von Rasch to Killer Karl Krupp and others like Blackjack Mulligan, Blackjack Lanza, and Pak Song. He was already one of the top heels in the country by the late 50s. While wrestling out of Buffalo in 1959, he suffered the first of numerous family tragedies. His oldest of then 3 sons, Jackie Jr., at the time 6 years old, touched a live wire while he was outside during a storm, was given a major jolt and knocked unconscious. He fell into a puddle and drowned to death. It was about the same time that the second member of the Von Erich dynasty came along. Bill Shepard, who wasn't a relative, became younger brother Waldo von Erich to take advantage of the name Fritz had built. Since Fritz rarely returned east after the death of his first son, Waldo became the Von Erich that was a frequent challenger for WWF champion Bruno Sammartino in the Northeast, and was a headliner in the Cleveland and Buffalo areas where Fritz initially made the Von Erich name famous. Although his greatest success in the industry came years later, the only world title held by Fritz von Erich was a brief reign as AWA champion from July 27 through August 8 in 1963, winning the title from Verne Gagne in Omaha and losing it back in Amarillo. During that time period, Omaha, which had its own television and local promotion, sometimes recognized a different AWA champion than the rest of the promotion. Von Erich held the Omaha version of the title for a few weeks 1 year earlier, from July 31, 1962 through August 25, winning and losing it from Gagne. His national AWA title reign and second Omaha reign, since the bout was in Omaha and recognized nationally, started concurrently. However, the Amarillo match wasn't acknowledged in Nebraska, and Von Erich remained as champion for 5 more weeks before losing to Gagne on September 7, 1963 in Omaha. To this day, Fritz and Kerry Von Erich remain the only father-son combination to have held major versions of the World Heavyweight title. Members of both the Guerrero and Dantes family in Mexico have had father-son NWA lighter weight titles, with Kerry capturing the NWA title from Ric Flair on May 6, 1984 in their famous Texas Stadium match, and losing it back to Flair on May 24, 1984 in Yokosuka, Japan. At the same time, he was one of the top heels in the country, cherry-picking top dates in numerous territories at the same time while being based out of Dallas. He was making a small fortune in the real estate market during boom periods in the Dallas area. In St. Louis, considered in many circles as the wrestling capital of North America, he is to this day considered, along with Buddy Rogers and Dick the Bruiser, as one of the 3 biggest drawing heels in the history of the city. He was also a key figure in the re-establishment of pro wrestling as a major draw in Japan in the wake of the death of its biggest star, Rikidozan, in late 1963. Because the Japanese magazines regularly covered the U.S. scene, the top stars in the United States like Bruno Sammartino, Kiniski, and Bobo Brazil could come to Japan and draw based on photos of them in main events around the U.S. Von Erich fit into that category and was a superstar in the Orient before he ever stepped foot on Japanese soil because of 2 victories using his Iron Claw over Antonio Inoki in 1965 in Texas. It wasn't until November 28, 1966, that Von Erich first came to Japan. His wins over Inoki and reputation from the U.S. set up the natural meeting against the Japanese Wrestling Association's top star, Giant Baba, in Osaka for the international title. Baba won their first meeting via countout, but submitted to the claw in the second fall and was bloodied up by the giant hands. This set up one of the biggest matches in Japan of the era on December 3, 1966 at Budokan Hall, where Baba retained the title, winning via DQ, which was notable for 2 other factors. It was the first time pro wrestling ever sold out Budokan Hall. It was also famous for one of the funniest things ever in a major match in Japan. Von Erich used the Iron Claw and Baba went to blade his forehead. Baba accidentally scraped the blade instead of across his forehead, across the fingers of Von Erich, who was bleeding badly from the fingers. Since this match aired live on national television at about 8 p.m. on a Friday night and drew an incredible rating, the press quickly had to come up with the cover story that Von Erich went into the match with a painful hangnail. After just those 2 matches, Von Erich had surpassed Kiniski, Destroyer, Fred Blassie, Bruno and Bobo as the biggest foreign heel in Japan. As famous as Von Erich was to the general public non-wrestling fan in Japan, largely stemming from that famous match, it paled in comparison to the term Iron Claw, which surpassed the vampire teeth of Blassie, the cocoa butt of Bobo, and the figure 4 of Destroyer as the most feared maneuver in Japan. The success of that move may have been the first example of blurred reality in the Von Erich wrestling family. Atkinson was a large, strong man with huge hands and a strong grip. If he really put the claw on a man's temples, with his grip, it hurt like crazy, but it was not a death grip either. While he used to brag about the power of the claw in his wrestling interviews, and with his demonstrative style and direct voice which made him one of the greatest pro wrestling interviews that ever lived, he was able to sell himself and the hold. But he also liked to brag about it outside the ring, which resulted in 2 famous humorous incidents. Once in San Antonio on a television show when he was in the middle of a run of weekly sellouts on top of the most feared heel in the city, he bragged about nobody being able to break the hold. The sportscaster, thinking he was playing into the joke, challenged him to put it on, and he did, putting the pressure on. The sportscaster, who was starting to get in some pretty serious pain, responded with a claw of his own, to the testicles, and Fritz was in even greater pain, dropped his grip, and limped out of the television studio with his heel persona taking a beating in the city. Another was a time he was bragging about his hold backstage to the boys, saying nobody could break it. Danny Hodge, the perennial world junior heavyweight champion who legitimately pound for pound was probably one of the toughest men ever to walk planet Earth, accepted the challenge. Atkinson put the hold on and Hodge not only didn't sell but didn't even register any effectiveness of it. Finally Atkinson gave up the grip, walked away, swearing under his breath about being shown up. Seeing his and his hold's popularity, JWA protected Von Erich as the ultimate foreign monster heel by never having him lose conclusively in a singles match during that era. And with him running his own territory and not wanting to travel, his tours to Japan were rare, and he never appeared more than a week at a time, making his live appearances that much more important and only adding to his image and drawing power. He challenged for Baba's title on May 21, 1967, going to a double count out. 2 days later, teaming with Waldo, they lost to international tag team champions Baba and Michiaki Yoshimura. On May 24th, Baba and Fritz met in a non-title match at the Denon Coliseum in Tokyo, with Fritz winning on a count-out in the third fall, one of the very few losses Baba suffered during that era. This set up another title match 2 nights later in Sapporo, where Baba finally scored his elusive pin in the third fall. However, there was still a measure of controversy since Baba's second fall win was via DQ. It wasn't until March 3, 1970 when they were rematched in Nagoya, going to another double count-out. On the same tour, he teamed with Curtis Aokiya to lose, challenging for the international tag belts against Baba and Inoki. On September 4, 1971, they held another rematch at the Denon Coliseum, which Baba won via DQ. He also went to a double count-out 2 days later in Nagoya when challenging Inoki for the United National title, in what turned out to be their final singles match ever. After the big promotional split in the early 70s, where Baba left JWA and formed All Japan, Von Erich made one last JWA tour. On April 13, 1973, he challenged Korean legend Kim Il-Kintaro Oki, who had been chosen as Baba's replacement, as the top star and international champion, going to a double count-out. 5 days later in Yaizu, he teamed with Killer Karl Krupp as the Iron Claw Masters and beat Il and Umanosuke Ueda to win the international tag team titles. As it turned out, JWA then folded, and those tag titles wound up in the hands of Krupp and Carl von Steiger in the Amarillo territory, who lost them to the Funks, who brought the belts to All Japan, where they have remained ever since. Fritz debuted with All Japan in December, and challenged to Baba, now PWF champion, losing via DQ in the third fall on December 13, 1973 in Osaka. Finally, the next night in Tokyo, a rematch was held, one fall to a positive finish, with Baba finally gaining his elusive pinfall victory in 17-16. He only made 2 more tours of Japan, but by this time he was no longer the top foreign star. During the summer of 1975, he lost twice while challenging Jumbo Tsuruta for the United National title, and on July 25th, in what is still the only gimmick match in the history of the All Japan promotion, he lost a Texas death match with no referee to Baba when he was knocked out and couldn't continue in 16-26 in a match billed to determine the #1 contender for then world champion Jack Briscoe. His last tour was in January 1979, where he teamed with Baron von Raschke as the new Clawmasters tag team, lost a singles match to Tsuruta, but his prime order of business was bringing Bruiser Brody into Japan for his first tour and working with Brody to get him over in Japan as that generation's top foreign heel. In January 1965, he broke away from established promoter Ed McLemore in Dallas in one of the biggest promotional wars of that era. He rallied all the North Texas area wrestlers together and pulled out the rug from under Macklemore to start his company, and with help from NWA member promoters like Sam Mushnick, Dory Funk Sr., Bob Geigel and others who he was a top draw with, parlayed his personal drawing power as leverage to get talent from them. He won the war and owned the Dallas wrestling territory. In the midst of the bitter fight, longtime Houston promoter Morris Siegel, who sided with Macklemore in the fight, passed away of a heart attack which resulted in Paul Bosch running Houston. In the case of Mushnick, who he remained close with for decades, who pulled many of the strings to help him win his promotional war, he had to promise that when he won, that he would have to hire the key people he put out of business for the good of the business, which he did. So Macklemore was still, to the public, the Dallas area wrestling promoter. By the summer of 1966, Fritz broke up his tag team with hated Hawaiian Japanese heel Duke Kyomika, and started the feud that turned him babyface. He then, as many if not most wrestlers who doubled as owners of their territory did, built the company around himself, usually battling the charges of perennial rival, manager Gary Hart. Among his famous rivals were Kyomika, Brute Bernard, Johnny Valentine, The Spoiler, Kinji Shibuya, Boris Malenko, Toru Tanaka, Missouri Mauler, The Blackjacks, Bruiser Brody, John Studd, Ox Baker, Stan Stasiak, Ken Patera, Ernie Ladd, Great Kabuki, and finally King Kong Bundy. A generation later, he built the company around not only himself but his sons, likely because he learned from the example of himself that building anyone else as the strongest character in the company would give that person the leverage to do to him what he was able to pull off. Shortly after winning the war and turning babyface locally, he slowed down when it came to working outside dates. He told the other promoters who wanted to use him at the time that he wanted to stay home and raise his family. In 1967, before a sellout crowd of 18,000 at the St. Louis Arena, he challenged Kinniski for the NWA title and said that if he failed to win the title, that he would never wrestle in St. Louis again. He lost and actually never returned to the city where he was such a powerful force until 1979 to supervise and play a minor role in the angle that made son David into a national superstar. While he was the top babyface in North Texas, he continued to work as the top heel in South and West Texas through the 60s, before scaling back his schedule to only his home area by the end of the decade, and for the rest of his career. By this point, he was among the most powerful individuals behind the scenes in the industry. The main Texas wrestling territory, a secondary territory, was in West Texas, based out of Amarillo, run by Dory Funk Sr., with Fort Worth running every Monday, Dallas every Tuesday, San Antonio every Wednesday, Corpus Christi every Thursday, and Houston every Friday had become the NWA's most lucrative territory by the early 70s, with the likes of Valentine, Wahoo McDaniel, Jose Lothario, Red Bastian, Stasiak, Thunderbolt Patterson among the headliners. It wasn't unusual for the top guys to pull in $2,500 to $3,000 in a good week, which was phenomenal money for that time. Atkinson ran the territory, heading the booking office, and for a booking fee supplied talent for Joe Blanchard, San Antonio and Corpus Christi, and Bosch Houston and surrounding cities, so he was running his own shows and making a percentage on everyone else's. He was considered the master of building the big show, which was usually himself challenging for the elusive NWA World title. While he had dozens of NWA title matches over the years, the most famous were in the late 60s at Texas Stadium when a no-DQ match with Kinniski ended with special ref Blanchard turning heel and throwing dirt in his eyes, an ending even more ironic years later since Blanchard and Atkinson wound up as hated enemies and promotional rivals in the early 80s, and the most famous match ever in that era of Texas wrestling, on June 24, 1972 at Texas Stadium, setting a state record of 26,339 fans to see Von Erich and Dory Funk Jr. battle to a 60-minute draw in 105-degree temperature. The attendance mark lasted 12 years until the night Kerry beat Flair for the NWA title finally to the fans of North Texas, climaxing the 20-plus year tease of a Von Erich challenging for that title. Fritz Von Erich was considered a star of the caliber to be considered as world champion, but never held the NWA title. During the 60s, probably the main deciding factor between himself and Kinniski, a rival who he was good friends with until the mid-80s, was that the NWA in those days wasn't going to have a world champion with the name of Fritz Von Erich because the title itself was supposed to not be tarnished by a gimmick, such as an obvious fake name or gimmick-style performer, not to mention that current champ Luthez would have been far more amicable about doing a job for Kinniski than Von Erich. Mushnick, who was the most influential man in choosing the champion, tried to pave the way for him to become champion years later by revealing his real name as Jack Atkinson. In the early 70s, amidst a major power struggle within the NWA, there was strong consideration given to making Fritz Von Erich as world champion, although he'd used the dual name of Jack Atkinson for NWA title credibility. It never happened, but instead he wound up for a brief period of time as arguably the most powerful man in the industry. Mushnick had been president of the NWA on and off since its inception in 1948, and along with the credibility Thez as champion, had built the organization into the closest thing in modern history to a worldwide industry governing body. He solidified his power base, despite only running one city rather than a full-time territory, for getting the entire alliance out of an incredible amount of trouble in a Justice Department investigation of the industry, which turned up activities like monopolistic practices, blacklisting of wrestlers, and other unscrupulous behavior. Mushnick's close association with the veteran Congressman Mel Price kept him as the power force in control of the alliance through the 60s. However, by the early 70s, the younger promoters who weren't around to see him bail the alliance out of major problems wanted Mushnick out. A power struggle ensued, and in August of 1975, Atkinson was named president of the NWA, with the face-saving storyline being that Mushnick was retiring from the position and Atkinson, his longtime friend, was a hand-picked successor. While president, Atkinson brought his sons, Kevin, David and Kerry, to the NWA conventions in Las Vegas and told everyone, almost arrogantly, how his kids were all going to someday be NWA world champions. At the time, Kerry, who was in 10th grade, was already heavily into steroids, and as Fritz later revealed after Kerry's death, he was the one who purchased them for him in their obsession with making him a stud football and track star in high school and eventually a champion pro wrestler. Although it took more than a decade for the job to be completed, many point to this as the beginning of the end of the NWA. Atkinson was supposed to retire as an active wrestler because of how it would look for the NWA president to be an active wrestler, particularly under the name of Fritz von Erich, but decided against it because he felt he needed to keep himself on top, both to protect the business in his territory and make sure nobody else got over strong enough to fight him to take the territory. The president's job had in the past been, among other things, to book the world champion. However, with Atkinson wrestling and running his own territory, the job fell into the hands of Jim Barnett, who also became one of the true power forces in the industry. Atkinson cast the deciding vote in the decision to have Terry Funk beat Jack Briscoe and win the title in late 1975, and the world title itself changed at that point. When Mushnick booked the champion, while screw jobs and even more often time limit draws were plentiful, the champion always had to win the climactic match in every series against the challenger in order to preserve the idea that ultimately the champion was the top man in the business. After Mushnick left, screw jobs became the order of the day, and they became far more creative, and the champion won far less often, to the point the aura of the championship declined as the years went on, even though the belt itself was dominated by great workers such as Terry Funk, Harley Race, and Ric Flair. In addition, it became an every promoter for himself game rather than an alliance that protected all and thus maintained power. Moves, such as one to establish a national television show on cable years before Vince McMahon did such a thing, never got off the ground because nobody wanted television in their markets with wrestlers that they didn't control. In cities like Los Angeles, Atlanta and Detroit in the late 60s and early 70s, when a rival promoter would come into an NWA town, the NWA promoters would send all their top stars into the city for loaded-up shows that would knock the upstarts out of the box. By the latter 70s, this happened less and less, and promoters fended for themselves. Some lost wars or were weakened by non-NWA promoters, and by the time Vince McMahon came along and went national in 1984, the once strong alliance was in shambles and was finished off easier than anyone could have imagined. The strength of Texas wrestling also started to fade by the late 70s. Fritz himself was past his prime, but still, like many in the same shoes, trying to protect his territory by keeping himself as the main star. When his sons started wrestling, they weren't an immediate super hit, and the other promoters in Texas didn't want to headline and build their city around them like Fritz's calculated long-term plan was in North Texas. Joe Blanchard had his own son, Tully, who he wanted to push, while Bosch had Gino Hernandez. The inevitable splits took place, and Texas became a war zone. After the Funk sold their promotion to Dick Murdoch and Mulligan and it went belly up, Southwest Sports expanded into Amarillo. They also began running the San Antonio area in a war with Blanchard. None of the companies at the time were particularly strong until a few events took place. Fritz had built up strong religious connections by the late 70s as a famous TV celebrity in the area who talked about religion as often as he could. Jack had claimed he was deeply moved by a sermon in 1974, and shortly thereafter a divine voice guided him to open his Bible to Psalms 23. Later, the same force somehow made him pull his car off the road and ponder his sons. A former best friend, not to mention virtually all his detractors, believed him to be less than sincere in his constant religious talk. As a former best friend stated, Doris, who was deeply religious, was threatening to kick him out. By this time, Jack had already conceptualized his all-American family of wrestling superstars, and to save his family and his dream, became born again. In 1981, the local Christian broadcasting station began televising Atkinson shows and called the show World Class Championship Wrestling, which later became the name of the promotion. The shows featured rock music videos, musical ring entrances, and production values far ahead of what had been the industry standard. The show started airing outside the territory on CBN stations, which started giving the Von Erich kids popularity outside Texas. The huge reactions to the rock ring entrances, which actually had started largely by Michael Hayes 5 years earlier in several other territories, and had been done in big matches in Japan dating back even farther, and even before that with Gorgeous George in the late 40s, gave ring introductions a level of heat and began the match with an excitement level other promotions couldn't compete with, and soon every named wrestler in the country had their own entrance song. The kids, David in particular, had already become major draws in St. Louis after Fritz put together an angle in 1979 where then world champion Harley Race juiced and submitted clean in the middle to David's iron claw in a tape that played around the country. His kids got over to the point that when any of them faced Ric Flair, they started drawing impressive crowds that on occasion hovered near 10,000. But business was hardly booming the rest of the time. In what was supposed to be the biggest show of 1992, Fritz held his personal retirement match at Texas Stadium on June 14, 1982, where he beat Bundy with a full head of hair, which drew only 6,000 fans were in attendance in the 70,000-seat building. But in one of the legendary angles and feuds in pro wrestling history, on December 25, 1982 at Reunion Arena in Dallas, Terry Gordy slammed the cage door on Kerry Von Erich's head as he was challenging Flair for the title in a match with Michael Hayes as ref, which drew 12,000 fans and the first $100,000 gate ever in the state of Texas. It wasn't to be the last. Freebirds versus Von Erichs were born. The Dallas territory became one of the hottest in the world, and world-class wrestling became well-known in the more than 60 markets that the tape played in, and gained particular popularity in, of all places, Israel. Nearly every Friday night they sold out the Dallas Sportatorium, and the big shows at Reunion Arena sold out the 17,500-seat building on 3 occasions that year. Kerry Von Erich probably trailed only Hulk Hogan as the most popular wrestler in the country, and with his rock star look and competition bodybuilder physique, was the bestseller of all the wrestlers on magazine covers. There's a lot of speculation about what could have happened in wrestling history if things had played out differently. Atkinson, who still wielded tremendous power in the NWA, pushed for David to become world champion. The plan at one point in 1983 was for, after the title was taken from Flair and given to Race, for David to win it on Thanksgiving night at Reunion Arena in a match David was to vow to retire from wrestling should he lose. As history shows, such a match never took place, and instead on that same night, Starrcade was born in Greensboro, North Carolina, and Flair regained the title from Race. There were several factors behind the scenes, but a key unanswered one is that suddenly Fritz simply stopped pushing for David to win the title, although there was a general feeling that David was being groomed for the belt. David died in Japan on February 10, 1984 at the age of 25, with numerous reasons being given depending on what day it was. The official cause of death was listed as an inflamed intestine, but it is generally believed that David went out on the town in Tokyo with Bill and Scott Irwin, who were wrestling as the Super Destroyers, drinking heavily at Ribera Steakhouse, then went back to his room and took Placido's, and died that night. When he wasn't in the lobby for the bus to take him to his first match on the tour, Ref Joe Higuchi and wrestlers Bruiser Brody and Jerry Morrow broke into his hotel room and found him dead on the floor. Before the police came, as the story goes, a hotel room was cleaned out of the drugs by the wrestlers on the All Japan tour to save both the Von Erich name and the company reputation. Drug use was already epidemic in an industry which consisted of fast times, fast people and fast money, and likely worse in world-class wrestling and among the kids named Von Erich than anywhere else. There were numerous stories of aides trying to tell Fritz about the problems with his kids, and Fritz would hear nothing of it and fire the messengers. Through Fritz's ability at public manipulation, David died a hero's death, wrestling when he shouldn't, having a thrilling fight in Japan. Actually, he died the morning of his first match on that Japanese tour, where he took a kick in the wrong place. Within days, Heaven Needed a Champion became a record sold at the matches. Kerry vowed to win the title in memory of his brother. Fritz came out of retirement, and one of the biggest wrestling events of all time took place on May 6, 1984 in Texas Stadium, where 32,123 fans paid $402,000, at the time the second largest gate in North American pro wrestling history, as Kerry beat Flair for his short-lived NWA title run. Fritz was also 25% partner of Bill Watts for Watts House shows in the state of Oklahoma, which had its most lucrative year ever in 1984. In late 1983, Fritz had the chance to take over the prestigious St. Louis market. A promotional war had been going on with the NWA office, headed by Geigel, Race, Pat O'Connor, and Vern Gagne, and an independent using a lot of wrestlers from Von Erich's rival Southwest Championship Wrestling run by Larry Matusik, Mushnick's protege. The established TV time slot on Channel 11 from the Mushnick days, which drew incredible ratings, was up for grabs as the station was about to drop the NWA. Mushnick, although retired from wrestling, still had the connections with the station and was maneuvering behind the scenes. At the same time, Vince McMahon Jr. was about to embark on step one of what would eventually completely change pro wrestling as we know it. Mushnick tried to maneuver Matusik and Fritz together and steer the TV in their direction, but the morning when the station was going to make its decision, Von Erich was approached by Matusik, but ultimately decided against running against his former NWA business rivals. McMahon flew in from Minneapolis, where he had just the day before, unbeknownst to anyone in wrestling, closed the deal to snag Hulk Hogan from Vern Gagne, showed in St. Louis for a meeting with the station. The station went with McMahon, after he offered them $2,100 per week for the time slot, the beginning of his buying established TV time in major markets that wrestling fans were used to seeing, which was the first big blow against the NWA in that era's wrestling war. World-class wrestling remained fairly prominent for a few more years, but bad taste locally began to develop when one tasteless and depressing incident occurred after another, some in the work, most outside of it. Another young star, Hernandez, overdosed on cocaine. The string of incidents destroyed the company, each taking the promotional life out of Fritz's spirit. Kerry was busted with drugs in his possession coming across the border from Mexico. The evidence mysteriously disappeared in the police station. Mike, who was never physically equipped to be a wrestler and was in the business largely because of his last name, and then pushed far too fast as the next David, nearly died from toxic shock syndrome. Watts, in his attempt to take Mid-South wrestling to a bigger level, hired Fritz Booker, Ken Mantell, who then raided much of Fritz's top talent, including the Freebirds and Chris Adams, which resulted in a lawsuit going in the other direction. However, Watts was out of the wrestling business before the suit could go to trial. The kids, who were huge celebrities to younger kids, began ruining their reputation in their own territory. Local promoters and sponsors by either showing up incoherent or no-showing wrestling and public appearances. Another Von Erich was brought in, Lance, who looked like a model but couldn't wrestle a lick. Real name Kevin William Vaughn, Lance was billed as the son of Waldo, and thus the first cousin of the boys. However, when cousin Lance jumped to a rival promotion in Dallas, Fritz went on television and gruffly stated that not only was he not a cousin after telling people that he was for a few years, but what his real name was, and how he would take legal steps to make sure he never used the name Von Erich because he had the name trademarked. Mike's disease took its toll on him both physically and mentally. He was still put back in the ring and pushed as if he was a superstar. Kerry was in a motorcycle wreck in June of 1986, which he was lucky to live through. He came back too soon because business was bad and they felt they needed him back in the ring for a major show. And the saddest part of all was that this big return only drew 2,326 fans and resulted in worsening of the healing process before his leg properly healed and had to have his foot secretly amputated. Kevin nearly died in the ring, passing out and needing CPR from Tommy Rogers to save him. Mike was arrested a few times before finally killing himself with a drug overdose at the age of 23. The promotion first tried to come up with a storyline with the idea that Mike was kidnapped and foul play was suspected in an attempt to hide the suicide, but word spread in the legit media faster than they could get their angle over. Fritz, through Bruiser Brody as an intermediary, signed a talent deal for his sons and his company to the tune of $250,000 per year from New Japan Pro Wrestling, switching their affiliation from All Japan, a deal that raised some eyebrows because of what was believed everything Baba did for him in the wake of the death of David. After Jim Crockett basically took over the NWA and made it difficult for other promoters to get good dates on Flair without cutting Crockett in for a piece, Fritz pulled out and created his own world-class heavyweight title, which Kevin and Kerry were to be the mainstays of. However, the local fans never took that championship as a serious world title, so the big drawing world title matches that had been the hallmark of the territory were no more. Fritz had tastelessly built a show around David's death, the annual David Von Erich Memorial Parade of Champions dating back to the 1984 Texas Stadium show, the first few of which drew big crowds, and after Mike's death had it renamed the David and Mike Show, and a combination of worsening talent and promotion and lack of taste put the crowd back in the ballpark of when Fritz had his own retirement match. With the promotion on its last legs, Fritz did his final wrestling angle on a Christmas night show at Reunion Arena, being attacked by several heels and faking his own heart attack, although the term heart attack was never used after the first weekend after the angle, and near death, playing on the sympathy area fans had from the real deaths of two of his children. Even the most callous wrestling promoters at the time couldn't believe he'd go to such lengths. particularly since his condition as updated each week on television would improve and degrade based on the Friday Night House. If they drew a big house on television, they'd say Fritz was getting better. If the house was down, suddenly Fritz's condition had gotten worse. The angle did revitalize a dying promotion over the short haul, but a few months later, he finally got out of the wrestling business. He largely lived a life alone in his final years. Chris, who wanted to be like Kerry but was only 5'5" with below average athletic ability, killed himself at the age of 21 in 1991. Chris, who was heavily into the drug scene, more than any of the brothers, wanted to be a wrestler, but wasn't physically equipped. When he was a small teenager, he did an angle where he tackled Gino Hernandez as he tried to run away from a head shaving after losing a famous double hair versus double hair match with Chris Adams against Kevin and Kerry at Texas Stadium before more than 25,000 fans. After a short time in the ring, a combination of ring injuries and problems with asthma made it impossible for him to continue, and unable to cope with it, he shot himself in the head. His wife Doris divorced him in 1992, blaming him for all the family problems. Finally, in 1993, Kerry, shortly after losing his job with the WWF over drug problems where he was billed as the Texas Tornado with his Von Erich name and Iron Claw downplayed, on probation for forging drug prescriptions, had cocaine found in his rent-a-car. Fearing the probation violation would send him to prison and ruin whatever hadn't been completely tarnished of his manufactured image, Kerry went to his ex-wife and told her that he would kill himself unless she promised to get back with him. She wouldn't promise to get back with him, and on February 17, 1993, he shot himself in the throat, thus for the most part ending the Von Erich legacy in the ring. Some wrestling fans called it the Von Erich curse, or incredible bad luck, but that would be ignoring a pattern of messages sent out loud and clear. Perhaps the only luck was Kevin's, having survived his tumultuous youth and upbringing, at least one public death scare, and getting totally out of the wrestling business. There were too many incidents for it to be random bad luck. It was a family and the wrestling industry in one part of the country destroyed by a combination of drugs and a life of having all your transgressions covered up to the point one feels immune to having to deal inwardly with problems. Then when problems come that can't be covered up, with no experience at dealing with it, people tried to escape from them, first with more drugs, and then escape from life. Fritz pushed his first 3 kids to stardom before they were ready. As much as it worked for the public, they couldn't handle the pressures that come with celebrityhood at a young age. But in at least some cases, it wasn't a life they wanted, but a life they felt duty-bound to lead. His next son was pushed totally beyond his element, and the final son grew up with the idea of where he was going to end up, but unfortunately that wasn't his destiny. While Fritz would outwardly deny and not accept when his lieutenants would call attention to the drug problems, he still provided them with a doctor who would get them whatever they wanted in whatever quantity they wanted. The only brother still alive, Kevin, now 40, a superstar in the business before the age of 25, who seemed to lose his interest in wrestling in the mid-80s, wasn't wrestling much before Kerry died, and wrestled sparingly after Kerry's death, and has been out of the wrestling business for several years now. Neither the WWF nor WCW acknowledged the death of Atkinson on their flagship Monday night television shows, although Dusty Rhodes did mention Fritz Von Erich on WCW Saturday Night, noting that Von Erich had given him his first break in pro wrestling. Jack Atkinson was admitted by Baylor Medical Center on July 25 after a mild stroke. Upon examination, doctors found cancer that had started from his lungs, had spread to his brain and adrenal gland. At that point, it became little more than a sad waiting game. Two of the oldest wrestling promotions in existence appear to be in grave danger, the USWA and All Japan Women. Mark Selker, one of the 3 Cleveland-based part owners of the USWA, filed a lawsuit on September 11 against Jerry Lawler and Larry Burton, the latter of whom controls the other 50% of the ownership, charging fraud in the sale of the company. Lawler was served with the lawsuit papers by an armed guard at the television tapings 2 days later. Selker sent a memo to the wrestlers at the September 14 house show in Memphis stating that this wasn't a USWA Incorporated card and he wasn't responsible for paying them. The show went on as scheduled before a crowd of 207 fans, with Larry Burton agreeing to pay the wrestlers. A subsequent show was scheduled for September 16 in Louisville, headlined by Lawler vs. Tommy Dreamer, with Burton saying he'd pay the wrestlers for both that show and a casino show later in the week, which, canceled, would violate an important company contract for a regular guaranteed money casino date. Lawler was scheduled to fly into Louisville for that show after doing voiceovers for Raw the day before. Earlier on September 16, Eugene Selker, the father and attorney for Mark Selker, tempted and was turned down in federal court in Cleveland in an attempt to get a temporary restraining order to keep Lawler and Burton from doing any business within the company until the resolution of the lawsuit. Selker attempted to cancel the Louisville show, and every other show on the books has already been canceled. At this point, television is still scheduled to be taped on September 20th in Memphis, but there is discontent at WMC-TV in Memphis, and with poor ratings in the movie To Midnight combined with all the problems such as an armed guard coming to television and serving Lawler, which nearly turned into a physical altercation, police being involved as a shoot on recent television shows, and the latest problems, it wouldn't shock people to see the station finally wash its hands of its longtime powerhouse wrestling show. Atsuko Mita, Mima Shimoda, Shaparita Asari, Saya Endo and Yuka Shino will all officially leave AJW as rumored after the company's big show on September 21st in Kawasaki. The loss of Mita and Shimoda is a big one since the company had been almost everything around them as the top heels. In addition, the group after this week will be down to a skeleton crew with only 11 women on the roster, one of whom, Tomoko Watanabe, is currently out of action after an operation on September 4th after suffering a broken rib, although she was expected to return on September 21st. Largely due to losses in real estate as opposed to pro wrestling, the AJW company is $22 million in debt, and none of the employees have been paid in nearly 5 months. The Matsunaga brothers, who have owned the company since its inception in 1968, have gotten so deep in debt with bank loans that they've been no longer able to even handle the interest on the debt, let alone the principal. If they declare bankruptcy as a protection against the debt, by Japanese law they won't be able to start up the business again for 3 years. The women who have left the company, those mentioned along with the likes of Asia Kong and Kyoko Inoue, are attempting to get a sponsor to open up on their own, with a January target date. Until that point they will attempt to get booked with other companies, but at this point only Kong and Inoue have gotten any bookings. The lawsuit against Lawler and Burton alleges mail fraud, theft by fraud, fraudulent business practices and fraud as it relates to the sale of the company. The claim in the suit is that Lawler and Burton doctored the books to inflate the value of the company, syndication profits and potential were inflated, expenses were understated, and the defendants withheld important information from them, including the knowledge of the expected time slot move on WMC. There have been rumors of criminal charges being filed as well, but at press time that hadn't happened. Lawler claimed that it was just a case of people buying a business, then losing money in the business, and then suing the previous owners. Both Lawler and Burton claimed that the Selkers had done the same scenario with 2 previous businesses in an attempt to gain complete control of the company and remove Burton from the company. The Selkers' idea is to shut the company down temporarily except for continuing to produce television, but the question is, with the company shut down, who would stay in the area to work television? This has, among the wrestlers, put Burton in the babyface role since he's the one who is now paying them. Eugene Selker, the attorney listed as filing the lawsuit, was the same attorney who wrote the contract in the initial sale of the company, a point Lawler and Burton have been quick to point out. It has been expected that when this ownership group bails out, and them doing so wasn't unexpected, that the WWF would attempt to take over the territory and use it as a grooming ground for inexperienced wrestlers they have under contract, but control the booking of that talent, which they didn't do in previous incarnations of attempting to use USWA to train wrestlers. At this point, until everything is settled, the WWF isn't expected to send any new talent to Memphis. The other legendary Texas wrestling family, the Funks, had a celebration and an ending of an era as well on September 11th in Amarillo at the Fairgrounds Coliseum. It was billed as 50 years of funk, as Dory Funk Sr. came from Indiana to Texas in 1947 and eventually became the biggest wrestling star and owner of the territory based in Amarillo until his death in 1973. It was also billed as the final match for Terry Funk in his hometown where he started wrestling in 1965. Terry and Vicky Funk promoted the show, combining talent from the WWF, ECW, FMW and JD for a card that will air on Japanese cable television. The main event, Terry Funk against Bret Hart, was also taped for a movie, tentatively titled Beyond the Mat, a documentary to be produced by Barry, Nutty Professor, Blaustein in conjunction with Ron Howard, and with 2 of the ECW matches scheduled to air on the television show this week. The show drew nearly a full house of 3,800. The highlight, even more than the live crowd that responded well to nearly every match, no matter how good or bad the quality was a ceremony before the Funk Hart match. After Hiromichi Fuyuki, who Funk will wrestle for the old NWA Texas Heavyweight title on September 28th at Kawasaki Baseball Stadium, came out to issue a challenge, all the ECW wrestlers on the show along with Paul Heyman, Dory Funk, and Terry's wife and family got in the ring. Heyman gave Funk much-deserved credit for helping take ECW to the level it has reached and presented him with a replica ECW World Heavyweight title belt, which he said was for being a lifetime ECW champion. Hart, who was accompanied to the ring by Father Stu and brothers Ross and Bruce, then said that he believed Terry Funk was the single greatest wrestler in the history of the business and mentioned that as a kid he spent a lot of time living with both Dory and Terry and he thought that Amarillo wrestling was the greatest wrestling that there ever was. Among the people backstage who weren't part of the live show included Taka Michinoku, Sam Houston, Grizzly Smith. The show was promoted locally off 6 weeks of ECW television that aired past midnight on the NBC affiliate. The crowd there recognized and reacted to the ECW wrestlers, although only Sandman got a great pop coming out. It appears that Heyman and Funk will try to promote another show in Amarillo in early 1998, which would be a total ECW card. 1. Wing Kanemura from FMW pinned Roadkill from ECW with a senton off the top rope in 5:59. Both guys worked really hard. Kanemura is a very good worker because he carried Roadkill, who at no time looked bad. Even though Kanemura worked face style and got the crowd behind him with a fast opening and a tope, before long there was a USA chant. 1.5 star. 2. Taz retained the ECW TV title beating Chris Condito in 7:19 with the Katajim. Taz did a lot of good mat wrestling and submissions early that the crowd didn't react that well to. This was surprising since one would think with the USWF drawing so well locally, that there wouldn't be a city in the United States where that style wouldn't get over better. The crowd did recognize when Condito folded his arms that he was mocking Taz. At another point Condito missed an Enzujiri badly that Taz sold, and the crowd groaned big time. Taz did some nice suplexes and Condito used a Frankensteiner off the top before Taz finished him off. 2.25 stars. 3. Shark Tsuchiya of FMW pinned Kuga of JD after a lariat in 6:55. The ring announcer, who is the same guy who was such an awesome ring announcer for USWF, was beyond clueless here. He introduced Tsuchiya as Kuga and vice versa, despite the fact Kuga has her name tattooed on her thigh. Not good. 1/4 star. 4. Mark and Chris Youngblood, with their father Ricky Romero, who was the old Amarillo circuit's top babyface not named Funk during the late 60s and through the mid-70s, beat the Bushwhackers in 10:20. Youngbloods, who were local, got a huge pop. This match had more heat than probably any match on the show except the main event, despite the Bushwhackers' work being horrible, particularly their selling for the comebacks. All the 70s Indian gimmick stuff, the war whoops and the beating on the mat like a tom-tom to get the guy in the ring to make his big recovery, got over like a charm. Finish saw Luke have Mark up for a body slam when Chris dropkicked Mark's back and he fell onto Luke for the pin. 1/4 star. 5. Balls Mahoney pinned Bubba Ray Dudley in 6 minutes. This was scheduled as Sandman vs. Balls. Sandman, who hasn't recovered from all his recent injuries, came out first and got by far the biggest reaction of any of the ECW wrestlers for his beer drinking and smashing the cans on his forehead gimmick. He was covered with blood by the time his ring entrance was over. Dudley showed up announced as being Mahoney, and jumped him including caning him in the crotch. Sandman sold the beating incredibly well, including foaming at the mouth while writhing in pain with the cane still stuck in his crotch. The match, which had already been announced as a no DQ match, was then ruled a no contest. Mahoney came out and challenged Dudley. Dudley smashed 2 beer cans on Mahoney. These guys missed a lot and the referee only made the match worse by counting a pin after 2 cane shots despite the fact Dudley clearly kicked out and it wasn't the planned finish. Everyone in the ring looked pissed when the ref counted 3 and stopped the match. Sandman then recovered and gave Dudley some cane shots. Balls never did get to do the chair shot that was supposed to be the finish. After the match with Sandman still holding his crotch, Balls gave him a beer. Sandman put it on his crotch as if it had magical healing powers and smiled as if he had recovered. -2 stars. 6. Shane Douglas retained the ECW title beating Tommy Dreamer in 10:09. The crowd reacted more to the women coming out than the wrestlers, although Douglas worked very hard to get heat by insulting Funk. Dreamer smashed 1 plastic beer cup after another on Douglas. Douglas came back with hard chair shots and dropped the knee on the chair. Francine jumped on the knee as well. The match was announced in the intros as being no time limit. Then at the 5 minutes mark the ring announcer announced that there was 10 minutes left in the time limit. Douglas used the figure 4 but Beulah broke it with an eye rake. Douglas used a belly-to-belly on Beulah. The two traded a lot of near falls including Douglas using the belly-to-belly and Dreamer the DDT. Finally Dreamer gave Francine a piledriver, although Francine's head didn't come with 18 inches of the mat, but when he turned around after doing the move, was hit with another belly-to-belly for the pin. The psychology was really good, and the match built well, but Dreamer's actual wrestling early didn't look good. 2.5 stars. 7. Dory Funk pinned Rob Van Dam in 11:32. Van Dam did a good job in the match of selling Funk's offense, but, if you can believe this, was complaining backstage about having to put Funk over. As you can imagine, Dory got, with the possible exception of Terry, the biggest reaction on the show. With the exception of Terry and Hart, he was the best worker on the show. Van Dam did the running flip dive and landed short, so on the landing caught his foot on top of Funk's head, basically leaving a footprint on the top of his head. Van Dam's offense looked weak when it came to the punches and kicks, perhaps taking it easy on Funk. He would do an acrobatic spot, but the move that would hit Funk would look bad. Funk's offense was mainly the Bolo forearms, and Misawa forearms and some mat wrestling. There wasn't a lot of variety to the offense, but everything was solid and looked great. Van Dam used the Van Daminator, but Funk rolled out of the ring. He got a near fall with a frog splash, and another with an inside cradle off a spinning toe hold before Funk got the fall with a 3/4 Nelson and leg grapevine. 3 stars. Before the next match, they introduced Steve Nelson, USWF, to the crowd as the world middleweight champion. Nelson got a huge pop, which kills the theory I had earlier in the show when Taz submission moves weren't getting over, that the audience that came to this show wasn't the same audience Nelson draws from in the same building. 8. Mankind beat Sabu via DQ in 8:30. Sabu did a flip pescado and worked on Mankind's knee. Sabu's punching and kicking looked bad, but he hit on every high spot. It was almost hilarious as he missed a punch by a mile, then hit perfectly a springboard into a Frankensteiner off the top. Mankind messed up the spot where he hangs himself in the ropes. Sabu did a crossbody over the top onto Mankind and both fell through a table. He then unmasked him, causing some fans to react as if it were Cactus Jack, and tons more chanting "Dude Love." Sabu did his triple jump moonsault but landed on Mankind's knees. He came off the middle rope with a chair. Mankind came back with a mandible claw, and then Bill Alfonso interfered for the DQ and had the claw put on him. Match was disappointing as it was short, finish was flat, and except for a comeback sequence by Mankind, the actual brawling itself looked bad. 1 1/2 star. 9. Hayabusa and Hakushi, Shinsei Shinzaki, and Masato Tanaka beat Jake Roberts and Headhunters in 11:12. Roberts got the biggest pop of anyone not named Funk. Although he was overweight and laughing his way through the match, in no way did he hurt the match. The Japanese worked as the faces, but the crowd, due to the recognition of Roberts, cheered them. Match was okay, although Hayabusa and Hakushi really didn't do much. Biggest pop was Headhunter doing a picture-perfect dropkick off the top rope. Hunters did a lot of top rope moves but seemed unsteady in climbing. Finish saw Hayabusa pin A with a Firebird, Scorpio, splash. 2 1/2 stars. 10. Bret Hart beat Terry Funk in 25:07. Dennis Stamp, who was Hart's opponent in his first pro match in 1974, Hart, who was 16 at the time, was pressed into emergency duty when Stamp's scheduled opponent didn't show up, was the special referee. Stamp afterwards related that Bret, who now has a rep in wrestling for never hurting anyone in the ring, accidentally hit him hard in the groin during that match. This was a total old-style world title match, with Bret playing the role of scientific subtle heel he grew up watching Dory Funk play. After saying Funk was the greatest wrestler who ever lived, he said that he was going to give him a Canadian ass whipping. An excellent match with Hart mainly working on Funk's knee, and the match had great heat and intensity in the crowd. Between the environment, the style, and the crowd, this was very much like watching an excellent match from my childhood as well. I can't say enough for the performance of both men. At one point Funk tried a Vader bomb on Hart through a table, but Hart moved and Funk went through the table. Earlier in the week, the movie people went with Funk to an examination of his body, and you can just imagine all the damage 32 years of often crazy wrestling and many years before that of football has caused, with his knees being the worst. Hart was then brutal in doing the chairs to the knee. There was some concern from Hart since this wasn't a WWF match and thus his insurance didn't cover him, but he didn't hold back or coast and in fact worked much harder than he usually works on WWF shows. Finish was Funk, who juiced pretty heavily from chair shots, using a back suplex with both having their shoulders down, but Hart lifting his before the count of 3. Finish was totally flat and there was no post-match festivities in the ring other than Funk on the house mic thanking everyone, which should have ended a show of this type with, which is the only negative about the match. My own feeling is that the way the show was built, at some point during the show they should have had a ceremony honoring and listing the accomplishments of Dory Funk Sr. They did have a moment of silence before the show mentioning the death of Fritz von Erich. 4 stars. WCW's pay-per-view show of the week, Fall Brawl on September 14th from the Lawrence Joel Coliseum in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, was the typical WCW offering. A strong undercard with the match quality in the so-so range after the midpoint. The general reports were favorable, but not enthusiastically so. In this case, the main event that the show was built around, War Games, was among the worst War Games ever as a match, but the ending and post-match were among the most dramatic. The show drew a sellout 11,939, 11,024 paid, with a $213,330 gate, slightly more than last year's War Games in the same building, but a much higher gross with the increase in ticket prices. In all the WCW print advertising in the market, they listed Hulk Hogan as appearing on the show, which is blatant false advertising because it was known months in advance that he was skipping this show. The general belief as to why the teams in War Games weren't announced until the day before the show is only partly the typical lack of organization, but also because the way the Nitro hype was going, to make people think that perhaps Hogan and Sting would be on opposite sides until the announcement of the complete lineup of Team WCW 6 days before the show. Because of an angle during the show that involved Larry Zbyszko, he was brought in to do color instead of Dusty Rhodes, which turned out to be a major plus. The booking was top-notch in that the matches that needed controversial finishes for storyline reasons had them, and the waters weren't muddied underneath to where it seemed like Screwjob City because everything underneath was a clean finish. 1. Eddie Guerrero captured the WCW Cruiserweight title from Chris Jericho, Chris Irvine, in 1719. Great opener. Early on there was a sequence where Guerrero tried a la Magistral but Jericho reversed it for a near fall. When Guerrero used the gory special, which Jericho later reversed, Tony Schiavone talked about having never seen the move before. Geez, the last time I recall the guy using that move was 6 days earlier on Nitro and he's used it dozens of times since coming to WCW. Jericho also used a stun gun followed by a lionsault for a near fall. Guerrero used a dragon sleeper off a la Tapatia. As the match built, the two traded near falls back and forth. Jericho used a double bomb, then put Guerrero on the top for a superplex. Guerrero reversed the move on the way down and crashed on Jericho, then scored a clean pin with a frog splash. 3 3/4 stars. 2. Rick and Scott Steiner, Robert and Scott Reach Steiner, beat Harlem Heat, Lane and Booker Huffman, in 11:44 when Rick pinned Stevie Ray. The finish was a combination of Rick doing a clothesline and Scott doing a released German suplex on Ray, although the clothesline missed by a lot. Back and forth hard-hitting match with good heat. 2 1/4 stars. 3. Alex Wright retained the WCW TV title pinning Ultimo Dragon, Yoshihiro Asai, in 1843. The first half of the match was slow with Wright holding two different versions of the sleeper seemingly forever, which Dragon really never, nor considering how long he was in the holds, could sell. The second half of the match was really good, picking up with all kinds of hot maneuvers. Dragon did his Asai moonsault. He did one sloppy Frankensteiner spot. Wright did a dive over the top to the floor. To prove once again that nothing that goes on in the ring registers with the announcers, after Wright did that move, Schiavone said, "Have we ever seen Alex Wright do that?" When in fact he's done it dozens of times in WCW. Mike Tenay did explain because it was on pay-per-view it had an extended time limit for the TV title from the regular 10 minutes or 15 minutes on a television show, although never actually said how long. Dragon used a tiger suplex, a running Liger bomb, and a moonsault for near falls. He tried a Hurricane Rana, but Wright revered it into a cradle. Dragon came off the top but Wright met him with a dropkick for a near fall, but Dragon got a near fall with La Magistral. Dragon used a spinning Hurricane Rana off the ropes and a Dragon Sleeper, but Wright made the ropes. He tried the Dragon Sleeper again, but Wright reversed the move and wound up with a German suplex. 3 1/2 stars. At this point they did the angle where Hunter Hearst Helmsley, the NWO guys, attacked Kurt Hennig to injure him so he can't wrestle later in the show. 4. Jeff Jarrett beat Dean Malenko, Dean Simon, in 1453 to earn a U.S. title shot on October 26 in Las Vegas. Jarrett told Deborah McMichael to go to the back before the match started. Another good match. Malenko got the cloverleaf on but Jarrett made the ropes. Deborah came out at that point. After all kinds of near falls and reverses, Malenko was distracted by Deborah and Jarrett clipped him and put on a figure 4 for the submission. 3 1/4 stars. 5. Wrath, Brian Clark, and Mortis, Chris Klusaritis, beat Mang Yuliuli Fifida, and Barbarian Sinvalahi in 12:22. Crowd pretty much died for this match. Lone highlight was Mortis getting on Wrath's shoulders and superplexing Barbarian off the top rope. Finish saw Mang get the Tongan death grip on both James Vandenberg and Mortis, but from behind. Wrath hit the death penalty, Urinage, for the pin. 1¼ stars. 6. Giant Paul White pinned Scott Norton in 5:27 after a choke slam. Norton had control most of the match using his power to throw Giant around. Giant made a comeback using a nip-up, a drop kick and finished with a choke slam. Not bad for what it was. 1¼ stars. 7. Lex Luger, Larry Fole, and Diamond Dallas Page, Paige Falkenberg, beat Scott Hall and Randy Savage, Randy Poffo, in 10:19 in a no DQ match. Early in the match, Luger pressed Savage over his head and threw him over the top rope onto Hall. They finally started getting some heat on Page, including throwing him from one ring to the other back and forth. Hall stomped Luger between the two rings where he stayed as Page got beaten on. Hall decked ref Mark Curtis, who couldn't get his killer front face lock on in time. Mickey J came out, and Hall stomped on his head. This brought Zbyszko out from the broadcast booth. Of course Zbyszko and Hall had great heat as they yelled at each other. Zbyszko ended up shoving Hall, who fell over Luger, and then Zbyszko counted the pin. 2 stars. 8. Team NWO of Marcus Bagwell and Kevin Nash, and 6. Sean Waltman and Conan, Charles Ashenoff, beat Team Horsemen of Ric Flair, Richard Fliehr, and Chris Benoit and Steve McMichael in 1937. This really wasn't much of a match except for a strong performance by Benoit and some great bumps early by 6. It started with Benoit versus Bagwell, who really didn't do a lot in the first Big Show main event of his career. Conan was in next, followed by McMichael. By this point the match was pretty good. 6 came in and began saving the match with some great bumps. At this point Hennig came out with his arm in a sling to the Horseman corner. Flair came into the expected big pop, followed by Nash, who destroyed everyone. The crowd chanted for Sting. Hennig's dramatic against all odds entrance got no crowd pop at all, and he immediately took off the sling and gave the NWO members handcuffs to put on Benoit and McMichael. They all destroyed Flair. Every time they asked Benoit or McMichael to quit, they'd say no. Finally they put Flair's head to where they were going to destroy it with the cage, and McMichael said that was enough. Hennig still slammed the door on Flair's head. This was all an angle to cover for Flair having some cosmetic surgery, either a facelift or an eye lift, and taking about 2 months off. The fact this had been kept from everyone and how the timing, the card and everything else worked out in the end should show that as far as heat from the parody, while there was some legitimate heat and certainly from the NWO side there is a ton of heat on Flair right now, it sure worked out well for the storyline in the end. Didn't it? 2½ stars. Japanese television rundown. August 10th, All Japan, 1. Hiroshi Hase and Jun Akiyama beat Johnny Smith and Jinsei Shinzaki in 1839 when Hase pinned Smith after a urinage and Northern Lights suplex. Shinzaki was clearly outclassed by the other 3, although he took one big bump when he was knocked off the apron and leapt all the way over the guardrail, taking the bump onto the announcer's table. It picked up toward the finish, particularly the work of Smith, who stole the match by the end. 3½ stars. August 17th, All Japan, 1. Tsuyoshi Kikuchi pinned Daisuke Ikeda of Battlerts in 11:48 with a rolling German suplex. Only the last 3 minutes aired on television and it was decent too. Toshiaki Kawada and Tomo Honda beat Yoshihiro Takayama and Lacrosse in 14:52 when Kawada made Lacrosse submit to the stretch plum. Highlight was Kawada with Takayama as they have an inter-promotional feud going back from a baseball stadium singles match last year. Honda and Takayama are both clumsy, but both have shooter auras, Honda from the Olympics and Takayama from UWFI, so when they worked stiff it got over pretty good. 3 stars. August 23rd, New Japan. 1. Don Fry beat Kazuyuki Fujita in 6:40. Considering this was Fry's first Major League Pro match, he did some indies about 9 years ago, and Fujita has only been working a few months and the limitations of having to make the match look legit. They both did a great job. It was worked to look like a shoot, and with the exception of Fry's punches being obviously pulled, it looked pretty legit. Both have a ton of potential as wrestlers. Several submission and rope beaks winding up with Fry throwing knees and punches and did a combination choke and leg lock and the ref stopped the match. Fry didn't break and Naoya Ogawa hit the ring and there was a ton of heat for the pull apart, with even Antonio Inoki involved. Fry was doing the Steve Austin I'll kick everyone's ass gimmick and even slapped Inoki. 2½ stars. 2. Tatsuhiro Takaiwa pinned El Samurai in 16:42. The last 7 minutes aired and they were excellent. All kinds of big moves and near falls, including Takaiwa doing a Death Valley bomb off the middle rope and Samurai doing a reverse DDT off the top rope. Finally, Takaiwa did 3 consecutive power bombs, picked Samurai up high for what looked to be a 4th, but instead put him in a tombstone pile driver. Finish was awesome. 4 1/4 stars. 3. Great Muta pinned Steve Regal after a moonsault in 6:40. Regal wrestled well. Muta didn't do a thing until the final few minutes when he did his trademark spots. Should have been a lot better. 1 star. 4. Tatsumi Fujinami and Osamu Kido beat Riki Choshu and Kengo Kimura in 9:06 when Kido pinned Kimura with the Kido clutch, outside cradle. 1 3/4 stars. August 24th, All Japan. 1. Manukia Mossman pinned Yoshinari Ogawa to win the PWF Junior title in 16:10. Ogawa worked the knee and Mossman did a great job of selling the knee the entire match. He'd make comebacks and then the knee would go out. Mossman is still a little tentative in the ring because of inexperience, but has great psychology and aptitude. Mossman won the title turning a figure 4 into an inside cradle. 3 stars. 2. Akira Tao and Kawada and Honda beat the Triangle of Power, Steve Williams and Gary Albright and Lacrosse, in 20:04 when Honda pinned Lacrosse with a German suplex. Long match with no heat. Work was okay. 1 1/4 stars. August 30th, New Japan. They put all the G1 tournament matches from the first 2 nights into 1 hour of television, so most of the matches were heavily edited. It was disappointing because G1 traditionally has some of the best matches of the year, but you couldn't tell this year because they tried to cram far too much into this show. 1. Satoshi Kojima pinned Regal in 9:45 with a diamond cutter. Only finish aired and seemed okay. 2. Scott Norton pinned Junji Hirata with a power bomb in 6:31. Only finish aired and it seemed pretty bad. 3. Hiroyoshi Tenzan pinned Tadao Yasuda with a moonsault in 10:39. They aired the last 4 minutes and it had superheat. Yasuda is a 6'6", 320-pound clumsy ex-sumo who has become a cult figure as a New Japan undercard wrestler, particularly in Tokyo. He's improved to where he's somewhat okay and his trademark spots are over huge. Fans were going crazy hoping for the big upset, and Yasuda got a lot of near falls and kicked out of a lot of sure finishes to give the fans hope before losing at the end. This was probably around 4 stars. 4. Masahiro Chono beat Michiyoshi Ohara in 18:39 with a crucifix submission. Chono couldn't do much because of his ankle injury. Last 4 minutes aired and seemed okay. 5. Muta pinned Manabu Nakanishi in 10:25. Finish saw Nakanishi get Muta in the rack, but Tenzan distracted and ref and Muta hit Nakanishi with a screwdriver he had hidden in his boot. Muta put Nakanishi on the top, blew mist in his eyes, gave him a Frankensteiner and pinned him. Only the finish aired and seemed okay. 6. Shinya Hashimoto beat Kazuo Yamazaki in 11:35. Last 4 minutes aired and it was really good. Strong style action. They teased an American finish as they had a ref bump and the fans booed like crazy fearing a screwed job. However, Hashimoto put Yamazaki in the arm breaker and held it until the ref recovered and called for the bell. 7. Kensuke Sasaki pinned Marcus Bagwell in AO4 with a reverse Ipponze. Bagwell carried the match with his personality. Big pop when Sasaki kicked out of the buff blockbuster. 2 3/4 stars. 8. Tenzan pinned Kojima in 11:43. They aired 4:30 and it was excellent with great heat. Lots of near falls ending with Tenzan hitting a tombstone and getting the pin with a moonsault. 9. Norton pinned Muta in 6:31. Muta did more than you'd think, including a pescado. Norton won with a power slam out of nowhere. Average, 10. Hashimoto beat Chono in 5:45 with a standing ankle lock on the bad ankle. Smartly worked as they got an exciting match out of Chono despite his limitations. 3 stars. Puerto Rico. Ricky Santana beat Muhammad Hussein to win the Puerto Rican title on September 6 in Humacao. The last big show was August 29 in Bayamon before 600 headlined by Ray Gonzalez and Huracan Castillo Jr., Jesus in WWF, going to a boring 60 minutes, 56-28, draw for the Universal title. Fans started leaving at the 35 minutes mark. The other big match was Carlos Colon and Invader No. 1 versus Los Pastores, Bushwhackers, with Chicky Star, the real Golden Boy, in their corner. An imposter Golden Boy kept interfering to prove Star wasn't Golden Boy. Herbert Gonzalez and Santana ran in but were nailed by the flagpole. Finally Lale came out an unmasked Golden Boy, who had a second mask underneath revealing him as Invader number 2, which many fans recognized, since this Golden Boy was left-handed. The return to Bayamon was September 12th with Gonzalez defending against Sean Morley, who didn't show up, and I'd suspect they knew in advance since he's a Victor Quiñones guy, and Quiñones and this office are on the outs from them failing to pay Yoshihiro Tajiri and Ryushi Yamakawa when they came here, and he instead made a surprise appearance that night in Mexico for Promo Azteca, where he is in for 1 week as Pierrot Jr.'s bodyguard before going to All Japan at the end of the month. Cologne vs. Invader number 2 and underneath advertised included Mike Anthony, Mike Lazansky, and the Freebirds announced as Michael Hayes and Terry Gordy, who were supposed to be in this past weekend, and a wrestler called Lenny Lafon, who may be the Calgary wrestler Len St. Clair, along with a Puerto Rican tag team called Los Criminales de Guerra, War Criminals. A few months back the Freebirds were advertised as coming in, and they didn't. Vampire Warrior, Luna Vachon and Pastors have all left the promotion. The foreign talent brought in for anniversary weekend were all paid before leaving. Mexico. The annual anniversary show on September 19th at Arena Mexico has Leo del Santo vs. Negro Casas in a mask vs. hair match, plus Rayo de Jalisco Jr. vs. Cien Caras. This is the first big singles match between the two since their legendary mask vs. mask match 6 years ago at the anniversary show, which still holds the all-time record of 23,000 fans in the building. Atlantis and La Fiera and Lismark vs. Apollo Dantes and Mascara Año 2000 and Universo 2000. Brazo de Plata and Felino and Shocker and Mr. Niebla vs. Scorpio Jr. and Emilio Charles Jr. and El Satanico and Bestia Salvaje Lola Gonzalez in her retirement match, and Lady Apache vs. Linus Asuka and La Diabolica, Mascara Magica and Olympico and Tony Rivera vs. Karloff Lagarde Jr. and Halcon Negro Jr. and Valentine Maya and Ultimo Dragonchito and Ciclanchito Ramirez vs. Damian Cito and Pierrot Tito. The September 12th Arena Mexico drew less than 2,000 with Rayo and Atlantis and Fiera vs. Los Hermanos Dinamita on top. It was the final card before the anniversary show in the Santo Casas, yet Casas didn't even appear on the card, and because of that they didn't even do an angle to build up their match. Santo and Casas both weren't on the August 29th or September 5th shows either, so even though it's the two guys who have been pushed big all year, in a sense they go into the match cold. The plan is for Santo to come down from the ceiling a la Sting in his ring introduction. Super Crazy Hysteria Super Loco on WWF TV this past week. Oro Jr., named after the wrestler who died in 1993 who used to wrestle in the Minis division as Orito and later as Supernova in the Space Cadets foursome, and Mosco de la Merced all jumped from AAA and started on September 12th with Promo Azteca. Crazy came out in his Hysteria costume and took off his mask. Nova came out in his costume and then took off his mask and said he was going to wrestle as Oro Jr. since Oro was his best friend. Mosco also did a run-in. In addition, Venom jumped from AAA and starts on September 19th. For those looking for the ever-changing Azteca TV time slot, on September 13th the show aired at 1 a.m. AAA had its biggest card of the year on September 14th at Rio Nilo Coliseum in Guadalajara and shockingly drew a sellout of 18,500 with lots of people turned away for a cage match with Pero Aguayo and Pero Aguayo Jr. and heavy metal beating Sangre Chicana and Picudo and Cobarde, in which the final man left in the cage, which was Cobarde, losing his hair. Also on the show was a second cage match with Connect vs. Cibernetico, Octagon, back after his auto accident, and Mascara Sagrada Jr. and Latin Lover vs. Fuerza Guerrera and Killer and Blue Panther, and a women's hair vs. hair match with Martha Villalobos and Sexy Boom vs. Xochitl Hamada and La Practicante. It was the first show in the building in nearly 2 years, which may explain the size of the crowd. In retaliation for the wrestlers leaving, Antonio Pena is going to create a new Psicosis, a new Hysteria and a new Mosco. Leon Negro from Tijuana was introduced at the Rio Nilo show as the new Psicosis, with him claiming that he beat Psicosis to win the name. Leo del Gladiador, Archangel and Guerrero de la Muerte no showed the September 12th Arena Mexico show, which made them immediately become the leading candidates when it comes to speculation at filling the other new slots. Vampiro is on shaky ground in Azteca for frequent no-shows, and may not have done himself any favors in EMLL either, as he was scheduled in the main event on September 14th at Arena Coliseo against Apollo Dantes and no-showed that card. At first, the Tijuana Commission attempted to suspend Rey Mysterio Jr. for 6 months for no-showing on the August 29th show. Mysterio Jr. went to the commission and explained he was injured and had never agreed to do the show and was still advertised. What ended up happening was on the September 5th show, headlined by Santo vs. Felino, that drew 2,100 fans, that he went before the crowd and explained the situation and would make up the date wrestling in Tijuana shortly. All Japan. The Fan Appreciation Day show on September 15th at Korakuen Hall drew a sellout 2,100 headlined by a 60-minute draw with Hiroshi Hase and Toshiaki Kawada in Mitsuharu Misawa vs Akira Tao and Jun Akiyama and Kenta Kobashi in what I was told was a match that lived up to its expectations. It was Hase's final match of the year with All Japan as he's going back to his senatorial duties and will return on the January tour. Next tour focuses on a lot of singles matches. On September 29th in Matsumoto it'll be Misawa vs Gary Albright, Kobashi vs Akiyama and Johnny Ace vs Steve Williams. October 1st in Osaka has Misawa vs Kawada in a non-title match, Manukiya Mossman vs Daisuke Ikeda and Akiyama and Takao Omori defending the All-Asian Tag titles against Sean Morley and Johnny Smith. October 4th in Nagoya has Williams and Albright defending the tag titles against Kobashi and Ace and Akiyama vs Omori. October 10th in Hiroshima has Kobashi vs Lacrosse and Mossman defending the PWF Junior title against Rex King. October 11th in Fukuoka has Misawa defending the Triple Crown against Williams and Kawada and Tao vs Kobashi and Ace. The final card of the tour is the anniversary show on October 21st at Budokan Hall with Misawa vs Kobashi, which should be a Triple Crown match, Kawada vs Akiyama and Ace vs Albright. August 31st TV show with the Hase Kobashi singles meeting drew a 4.4 rating. New Japan. New tour opened on September 11th. Masahiro Chono returned from his ankle injury and his mystery partner in the tag team tournament turned out to be no mystery at all in NWO Sting. Thus far in the single elimination tourney, on September 12th in Sendai, Satoshi Kojima and Manabu Nakanishi beat Akitoshi Saito and Kengo Kimura and Tadao Yasuda and Shinya Hashimoto beat Michiyoshi Ohara and Tatsutoshi Goto. September 13th in Maebashi saw Junji Hirata and Osamu Kido beating Takashi Ishikawa and Kazuyuki Fujita and tag champs Kazuo Yamazaki and Kensuke Sasaki over Chono and Sting. It has been rumored, but not officially announced, that the first New Japan vs K1 match will be Shinya Hashimoto vs Branko Sigatek on October 19th in Kobe. Shiro Koshinaka is expected back for the October tour. August 30th TV show did a 3.6 rating. Other Japan notes. Akira Hokuto, 30, collapsed on September 8 working at her clothing shop and was hospitalized. All that we've been able to ascertain is that she had great pain in her back and her breast. Hokuto's back has been badly damaged from all the years in AJW, which is why she stopped working full-time, and it wasn't unusual for her to shoot up on painkillers in her lower back and knee before going into the ring. Her WCW women's title has been vacated and Chigusa Nagio will work twice on the September 20th Kawasaki show. First under his heel gimmick as Zero against Masami for the WCW title, and then as herself in the main event against Asia Kong. Speaking of Kong, she worked one of her final dates with AJW on September 11th in Saitama. Reports we are getting are that ticket sales for the October 11th Tokyo Dome, Hickson Gracie vs Nobuhiko Takada, are surprisingly strong. All the $900 ringside seats are gone and they are expecting a crowd of close to 40,000, so the show will be a financial success if that's the case. The September 28th FMW show at Kawasaki Stadium had topped 20,000 in advance sales as of 1 week ago. Apparently there was a horrible case of food poisoning among the boys in Big Japan. They went out to dinner after their September 14th show with the local sponsor, and after dinner went on the tour bus. 14 of the wrestlers got sick, throwing up and getting diarrhea, as did the ring announcer and owner Shinya Kojika. The September 15th show in Gifu had to be cancelled because there weren't enough wrestlers that would be able to work, and they were scheduled back on September 17th at Korakuen Hall. Kingdom had a show set for September 16th in Kagoshima that had to be cancelled because of a typhoon in that city, and it was rescheduled for December. LLPW looks to be pulling out of the Plum Mariko Memorial Show on October 30th. Michinoku Pro announced this lineup for October 10th at Sumo Hall: Yone Jinjin vs Magic Man, Tiger Mask vs Chris Condito, Satoru Sayama, Wrestling Without a Mask, versus El Satanico. They were big rivals in the late 70s in Mexico. Convict, Superboy from Los Angeles, versus Gran Hamada, Super Delphin and Naohiro Hoshikawa, and Masato Yakashiji versus Dick Togo and Men's Teo and Shoichi Funaki, Jinsei Shinzaki versus Undertaker, and Great Sasuke versus an unnamed WWF wrestler. Sunny will also appear at the show. Kind of a weak lineup for the group's biggest show of the year. Koji Kiao did a rare job on September 12th at Korakuen Hall in a WR 6-man tag title match as Kiao and Masaaki Mochizuki and Yoshikazu Taro lost to champs Koki Kitahara and Nobutaka Arai, and Lance Storm when Kitahara pinned Kei to set up a rematch on October 6th in Kawasaki. Dan Severn worked 2 matches this past week for IWA. On September 9th in Takayama, Severn and Tom Burton beat Katsumi Hirano and Great Kabuki, and September 10th in Fukui, Severn retained the NWA title in 8:47 with a Fujiwara armbar on Kabuki. USWA. The September 14th show in Memphis drew 207 fans, which is the smallest crowd ever at the Big One Expo Center, coming off the television being moved to midnight. In a Falls Count Anywhere match, Brian Christopher beat Billy Travis via DQ when Dutch Mantle and Doomsday interfered. Mantle beat Jerry Lawler in a bullwhip on a pole match due to interference from Travis. PG-13 kept the tag titles, beating Doomsday and Hardbody Harrison, and the USWA title match saw Bill Dundee beat Stephen Dunn when Spellbinder attacked Dunn, but Dundee refused to accept the belt under those circumstances, so Dunn retained. Here and there. There will be a Lucha show on September 28th at the Bronco Bowl in Dallas, Texas, with Atlantis, El Texano and La Parca among others. An indie group in Sioux City, Iowa on October 15th has a TV taping scheduled using Jimmy Snuka, Dan Severn, King Kong Bundy, Bam Bam Bigelow, Marty Jannetty, and Nails. Entertainment Tonight did a feature on Jeep Swenson on September 12th, blaming his death on his years of steroids. His widow, Erin Swenson, was on. Really nothing in the way of info given at all in the piece, and it was never mentioned that he was a pro wrestler, just an aspiring actor. Despite what was printed in the local newspaper, Hulk Hogan didn't attend nor give a eulogy at the funeral. James Caan was there and didn't give a eulogy, but Davey Boy Smith delivered a very emotional eulogy. A report on the September 6th boxing show in Atlantic City with Oleg Toktarov and Tony Halme is that Toktarov was actually the best boxer on the show. His opponent didn't know how to fight at all and got a bloody nose from the first punch and ran the rest of the way. In the second round, he put his head under the top turnbuckle with his arms covering his head and told the ref that he quit. Halme's opponent was a well-built guy who went down on the first punch, and the match was over in 17 seconds, and our live report said it looked big-time suspicious. NHB. The tournament bracketing has been made official for the October 17th UFC, with Carl Alvarado vs. David Beneteau and Gary Goodridge vs. Mark Kerr, which, provided there are no injuries, should make for a very interesting Kerr-Barreto final. Tank Abbott is being held off the show since he's got the Tokyo Dome on October 11th, and they want to use him in a singles match on the subsequent pay-per-view show, which the working plan is to be held in December or January in Japan. Severn has one last shoot match scheduled on September 20th in North Dakota before the UFC. Maurice Smith vs. Hoist Gracie isn't completely dead, although it won't take place on the November 9th Tokyo Dome. Smith is hoping to do the match after his contract with Rings expires at the end of the year. Randy Couture, who faces Vitor Belfort on the next UFC, placed 9th in the 220-pound weight class in the World Greco-Roman Championships on September 13th in Wrocław, Poland. Dan Henderson and Dennis Hall, both of whom are on the IWF pay-per-view show, were also in the Worlds. Henderson placed 7th at 187 and Hall placed 6th at 128. Mark Hall on September 14th was in a Vale Tudo tournament in Brazil, winning his first round match and losing in the second. After the show, he said that every match on the show was real and that someday he'd tell the truth about his match at Ultimate against Don Fry. That sure seems to tell you something, doesn't it? ECW no-shows over the weekend. All that was said on television about the Todd Gordon situation is that Paul Heyman was on and announced that Gordon was no longer commissioner due to time constraints from having to raise a family and run a family business. After the breakup, the two made an agreement not to say anything bad publicly about the other, largely because mudslinging back and forth would wind up with both covered in dirt. From what we've been able to ascertain, when the change in ownership went from Gordon to Heyman, the deal was that Heyman would assume the outstanding ECW debts, which Heyman believed was in the $140,000 range, but turned out to be closer to $400,000 due to some outstanding lawsuits. Heyman had about 4 months remaining on paying off Gordon. September 20th at ECW Arena has Sandman vs. Sabu, Tommy Dreamer and Beulah vs. Bill Alfonso, who may not be leaving after all, and Rob Van Dam, Jerry Lynn vs. PJ Walker, who will likely be given a new gimmick and a major push, and Dudley's defending against New Jack and Cronus. September 26th in Fort Lauderdale, Florida has Sandman and Dreamer vs. Sabu and Van Dam, and a triangle with Dudley's, Cronus and New Jack and Axel Rotten at Balls Mahoney. September 27th in Orlando has Sabu vs. Taz and Dudley's vs. New Jack and Cronus. Nothing definite one way or the other on attempting to bring in Doug Furnas and Phil LaFon from the WWF. They are also attempting to book Great Sasuke for one date in October to set up a match for the November 30th pay-per-view show, but at this point that is in the beginning stages of being set up. While no lawsuits have been filed, there have been legal letters going and forth from this side threatening a suit against WCW and an individual suit against Scott Levy. WCW. Nitro on September 15th in Charlotte drew 8,141, 400 shy of a sellout, with 6,808 paying $117,780. Before the TV started, they had 3 tryout matches. Bobby Blaze pinned Louis Spicolli, who was said to have been lighter and in better shape than in his ECW days, with a Northern Lights suplex in a match reported from several sources as being really good with both impressing. Chris Adams pinned Kendall Windham. Windham was bald with a goatee, looking like Steve Austin, and both were said to have looked bad. John Noor pinned Tim Horner in another bad match. Horner was said to have been steady but unspectacular, and Noor was said to have been no worse than in years past, but overall a pretty bad match. Noor and Barry Darsow both signed deals, although I believe they are short-term deals, while the others hadn't been offered contracts before their tryout, although we've heard reports Spicolli will be offered one based on his tryout. TV opened with a still shot of Ric Flair, with tubes up his nose and marks all over his face as if he'd been half-killed the night before, and Tony Schiavone, citing that it was Flair who got him into the pro wrestling business, was so upset he walked off the set and left the show to Mike Tenay and Larry Zbyszko. Luckily Zbyszko had one of his best efforts. The TV, however, was one of the weakest Nitros in a long time, and the live fans had nothing to cheer for, so it made the show dead from that standpoint as well. Dean Malenko beat Disco Inferno with the Cloverleaf in 4:11. Meng and Barbarian beat Harlem Heat when Meng used the death grip on Booker T in 6:29. Stevie Ray, who had a leg injury, looked really bad. Rey Mysterio Jr. beat Juventud Guerrera with a springboard Hurricane Rana in 7:03 of a really good match. Alex Wright kept the TV title, beating the returning Steven Regal. After all charges were dropped, he was officially rehired this past week in 4:32 with a German suplex. Regal looked really overweight and rusty, and it was a bad match. Giant pinned Conan with a chokeslam in 3:02, most of which consisted of Conan running away. Diamond Dallas Page pinned Stevie Richards with the Diamond Cutter in 3:37, after which Raven beat up Richards. Hall and Nash kept the tag titles, beating Wrath and Mortis in 5:59 when Nash pinned Mortis after the jackknife. Better than you'd think, but only okay. They had the NWO interview with Bischoff and Hogan, with Hogan bringing out a sign saying, "Hey McMahon, bite me." Eddie Guerrero kept the cruiser belt, beating Dragon with the frog splash in 6:06. Decent match but disappointing considering the talent involved. Finally, Hennig beat McMichael to win the US title with the Fisherman suplex in 6:30. They booked McMichael to make him look like the biggest inept fool on earth, and considering his wrestling ability, he doesn't need this much help from the bookers. Match was bad. Nitro drew a 3.81 rating, 3.88 first hour, 3.76 seconds hour, and a 5.9 share. Raw did a 2.54 rating, 2.38 first hour, 2.70 seconds hour, and 3.8 share. Nitro Replay did a 1.4 rating and 2.5 share. The head-to-head 5 segments saw Nitro at 3.76 and Raw at 2.46. Other weekend numbers saw Main Event at 1.3, Pro, which aired in a special Saturday noontime slot, at 1.0, and Saturday Night at 2.1. Wayne Bloom was offered a short-term contract. WCW will run a Nitro in February from the Alamo Dome in San Antonio, scaled back to basketball arena configurations, 20,000 capacity. Zbyszko will referee a match involving Hall, not yet determined, on the October 26th pay-per-view show. Only matches known are Hogan vs. Piper, Page vs. Savage, Giant vs. Nash, and Hennig vs. Jarrett. Jarrett's contract expires in mid-October. Hogan's contract expires at the end of the year, and he's already sent feelers to Titan Sports about returning for a big run. The general belief is that Hogan has no intention of returning to Titan, but is using it as leverage to get a better deal. Hogan has incredible leverage right now, as the execs at Turner probably feel the company turnaround and staying in the position is more due to Hogan, not that he isn't a strong part of it, than it really is. In addition, his contract is due about the same time as he's scheduled to drop the title to Sting at Starrcade, so he can use doing that job as even more leverage, because if Hogan doesn't put Sting over at Starrcade, It'll flatten out Sting big time and make this entire year of him not being on the road be almost a waste. Hogan is also back attempting to get Ed Leslie back in. Jim Duggan was mentioned on Nitro as doing an upcoming media appearance. No word if he's back just doing appearances or if they'll try and put him in the ring. During Nitro, several times during the show they focused on a sign saying Raw is taped, which certainly one would assume was a planted sign. WWF. Probably the biggest news of the past week revolved around Shawn Michaels' behavior at the Raw taping on September 9th in Muncie, Indiana. Neither Vince McMahon nor Undertaker were at the taping, and Michaels did an interview where he came out in tight biker shorts with a sock or sock stuffed in his crotch for whatever reason and proceeded to make some very lewd gyrations like acting as if he was humping Jim Ross, swearing during his interview and called out Undertaker, who was on a tape on the video wall. Everything was able to be edited off the show, and if you didn't know about the incident, you wouldn't even know the interview was heavily edited. Since Undertaker wasn't there, but since he was on a tape on the wall, people thought he was, when Michaels kept insulting him, calling him a big chicken shit, and begging him to come out and call him more names when he didn't come out. It made Undertaker look bad in the city, not to mention it being totally unprofessional. Whether Michaels was doing it in another attempt to get fired so he could go to WCW or he had other ideas up his sleeve, it's definitely brought a lot more negativity toward him in a lot of circles. Taka Michinoku is supposed to be very close to signing a 5-year deal. According to WWF officials, reports here of changing the policy on signs were incorrect. A report live said signs were being confiscated, and they may well have been, but were told not for political content, but perhaps because of obscenity. WWF has threatened New Japan with a lawsuit over the company having the old WWF light heavyweight title belt as part of the J-Crown, since WWF is introducing a new light heavyweight title shortly. Once word got out, then Hisashi and Hisatsune Shinma got into the same act and threatened New Japan over the Uswa belt that is part of the J-Crown. The WWF went to Japanese reports and asked if it would be better to file the suit or simply to get word to New Japan of the threat and not make a public spectacle out of it to allow New Japan to simply drop the belt on its own. Expect far more international tours as the company needs to establish new revenue streams overseas as cash flow is tight. There will be a tour the last week of October to Abu Dhabi. There is a tentative tour for Pakistan in November and perhaps one more tour before the year is out. Mark Merrow and Ahmed Johnson are expected back in action this weekend and should be on the MSG Raw on September 22nd. That show will almost surely do the largest gate ever for a Raw and isn't sold out at press time, but it's expected to be a sellout. Steve Austin should be wrestling by the end of October, but until that point will be on the road as guest timekeeper during Owen Hart's matches. On the September 8th Raw in the Triangle match, originally Bulldog was supposed to do the match and win the match when Rick Rude would interfere, helping Bulldog beat Helmsley, showing that Rude works for whomever pays the premium, but Michaels got the entire deal nixed. Both Super Loco and Pantera looked good at the tapings. Loco had a shotgun match against Brian Christopher and did some great moves in the process of losing, including a space flying tiger drop. He wasn't offered a contract, although Titan was impressed by him, and when he got back to Mexico tried to open doors to go to WCW. Pantera had a good match against Taka Michinoku on the September 9th Muncie, Indiana Raw taping. Paul Heyman asked WWF to release PJ Walker from his contract but was turned down. House shows this week saw September 9th in Muncie draw $3,329 and $47,503. September 13th in Philadelphia drew $6,084 and $118,020. September 14th in Hartford drew $3,962 and $63,822, and September 15th in Landover, Maryland drew $4,922 and $93,832. Merchandise for the week was $131,811 or $7.20 per head. All the shows has the basic same lineups: Brett vs. Taker, Bariquas vs. DOA, Dude Love vs. Owen, LOD vs. Godwins, Vader vs. Helmsley. Pillman vs. Goldust took place in Philadelphia. However, on Saturday night, Terry Runnels' grandfather died, so Goldust left the tour for the funeral and the Pillman-Goldust match was cancelled on Sunday and Monday. The one-night-only pay-per-view will air on a tape delay basis on Viewers' Choice Canada, but won't air on pay-per-view in the United States. It appears that Sergeant Slaughter may ref the Michaels-Undertaker match on the St. Louis pay-per-view, and that Michinoku may have a match and or a minis match, and that in the Dude Love vs. Pillman match, that if Dude wins, Goldust, who will be handcuffed at ringside, will get a no DQ match with Pillman immediately afterwards. October 24th at Nassau Coliseum has Brett vs. Taker and LOD vs. Michaels and Helmsley. All Japan is interested. Please don't ask me why. and using the Blackjacks for their tag team tournament, and since they aren't being booked in WWF, that's more than likely to take place. Most likely Bradshaw is going to be repackaged and the team will be broken up. Interrogator is being groomed for a program with Undertaker, which is why they put the no-sell spots with him working with both Shamrock and Animal on Raw to try to get him over as a monster giant heel. The original Mascara de Sagrada's ring name was Mr. Lucky. The Minis tag match was the in-ring highlight of the Raw show. Other weekend ratings saw Livewire at 1.5 and Superstars at 1.7. Wrestling Observer Newsletter. P.O. Box 1228, Campbell, California 95009-1228. This is the end of this program. Please remember to like and subscribe. See you next time.